All right. Well, welcome. My name is Caleb Cangelosi, and I am the founder of Log College Press. Log College Press is a website and a book publishing company. We are committed to collecting and to reprinting the writings of and about the 19th and 18th and 19th century American Presbyterians. Our little tagline is "The past is not dead, primary sources are not inaccessible, and the 18th and 19th centuries are not irrelevant." If you've never heard about Log College Press before, I encourage you to go check out our website, www.logcollegepress.com. This is the first time that I've tried to do any sort of interview or any sort of video chat. And so I've got with me today Mr. Dr. Miles Smith IV. Miles is a historian. Miles, I was talking to you beforehand. If I do this again, if I do this more than once, I might even start calling it Colporteur. Tell us what a Colporteur is.
Colporteur was in the 19th century, largely in the 19th century. I think they might have lasted a little bit into the early 20th. Sort of an itinerant book salesman of sorts. He would go around and show up at your doorstep. Most people lived on farms at that point, so maybe they would come to the farm. Sometimes they would come to market. Sometimes they would come to church doors at the end of a Sunday afternoon. In fact, there was some question over how religious they were because they would hawk books on the Sabbath sometimes. So that's what they were. They were itinerant book salesmen.
So that's sort of what we do at Log College Press. We've got thousands of original PDFs on our website for download for free. We also have books that we've reprinted and are selling. You can see some of them behind me here. Our most recent book, where did I put it? Hang on a second. Most recent book that we just came out with, Presbyterianism by Samuel Miller. You can buy all these on our website. Miles has just recently helped to edit the one that is about to come out as soon as we get it all wrapped up. It's by William Swan Plummer. It's entitled The Impeccable, referring to the person and the sinlessness of our Lord Jesus Christ. So looking forward to that book coming out. Miles, tell us a little bit about yourself. You're a historian, originally from North Carolina. Tell us about yourself.
Yeah, I'm from Salisbury, North Carolina. Was where I was reared. I went to college in Charleston, South Carolina. Did my PhD in Texas at TCU. Taught at a few places. I'll be in July. I'll be taking a job up in Michigan at Hillsdale College. So I am a teacher first, but I love to read about history, not just political, social, and intellectual, but also religious history. And so for those of us interested in religious history, Log College Press is an amazing resource. I want to put in a plug for it because I'm on the page all the time. So that's kind of who I am professionally. I got interested in history because I grew up in sort of an older town in the South. My hometown was founded in the 1750s, settled in the 1730s, founded as a town in the 1750s. And so you just kind of lived with it. When I moved to Charleston to go to college, you live with history all the time there. The College of Charleston's right downtown and all the historic buildings. And so it's kind of hard to get away from. I found out that I liked history and that I was at least okay at it in school. So I got a PhD, and God was very good to me. I managed to get jobs too. So, which is, those two don't always go together. So anyway, that's how I ended up here talking to you, Reverend Cangelosi. So
that's great. Well, one of the things that we're about at Law College Press is primary sources, and we want to make them as available as we can for researchers, for pastors, for Christians in general, for academics, for non-academics, to just have them there on the site. And so one of the things I wanted to ask you as a historian, just talk briefly about why are primary sources important? And then how do you recommend your students read them and interact with them? What advice can you give to folks who are browsing our site and coming across a lot of different types of primary sources?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first thing I'd say is primary sources are important, one, because they're primary, meaning they're written by the people who were kind of there. at a given event, or be it political, religious, social, whatever. It's the people who saw it. So they're the closest thing you have to an eyewitness. Uh, and so they're in some ways the most reliable. In other ways, they're not. We can't always trust narrators, but once we kind of figure out, who's trustworthy and who's not, primary sources become essential. They're the only way we can really write history, is by engaging them. Another reason they're important is because they're far more accessible, especially the sources on a site like Log College Press, than we tend to assume. We have this idea that something written before, like 5 minutes ago, we're not going to be able to understand it. And I think the important thing to realize is not every historic document is written in Shakespearean or Jacobite English. You can understand these sources. They're written by people who aren't so different than us at all. They have a lot of the same fears, same concerns, same loves, same joys that we do. And so when they're writing them, they're actually pretty easy to understand. You can read someone writing in the 1820s, 200 years ago now, and actually see, wow, it's kind of some of the same things I think about a given situation. There's differences too, but they're far more accessible and readable and useful than we, I think, in our minds give them credit for a lot of times.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And you think about just, it does remind us, like you said, that believers in previous centuries are not that different than we are. Same struggles, same issues. And today we're going to be talking about one particular believer, Pastor George Dodd Armstrong, who went through something very similar to what we're going through right now in the middle of this COVID-19 pandemic. He went through a yellow fever epidemic and lived to write about it. And so let me introduce George Armstrong for our viewers. He was born in 1813 and he died in 1899, born in New Jersey. He was one of 10 kids born to a Presbyterian pastor. He was a graduate of Princeton in 1832. And then he moved to Richmond, where his brother William was the pastor of First Pres Richmond, had followed John Holt Rice, one of the founding professors at Union Theological Seminary. While he was in Richmond, he taught. In 1836, he started at Union Theological Seminary, Armstrong did. He finished there. He was licensed to preach in 1838, but interestingly, he became a chemistry and a mechanics professor at the Washington College, eventually known as Washington and Lee, there in Lexington, Virginia. It wasn't until 1851 that he took his first call. He was eventually, in 1843, ordained as an evangelist, but 1851 is when he became the pastor of First Pres Norfolk, and he remained the pastor of that church, his only church that he pastored for 40 years. So until 1891, when he retired after 40 years. He wrote several books, and you can find his page on our website with all the books that we have collected by him. And so the one that we're wanting to talk about today is the book that he wrote on the yellow fever epidemic, which was called Summer of the Pestilence. And you have spent some time in the Virginia Beach, Norfolk area. Anything that you can add to Armstrong's life that you might have learned while you were there or through your own reading?
Yeah, I actually learned a few things about him. His pastorate is in my former hometown of Norfolk, Virginia, and I lived just around the block from the church. And so there's kind of a lot of little local lore. The yellow fever epidemic is, outside of a military event, the biggest thing to ever happen in Norfolk, and the imprint of that is still still there. Armstrong was known as an evangelical. He was pretty popular in town. He was the guy who sort of got everybody together. So he was actually pretty ironic. He wasn't particularly sectarian. He had close friendships with all the Protestant pastors. He actually knew, and we're pretty sure dined with the AME pastor as well in Norfolk. So he's maybe a little bit more willing to accept African Americans into his home than some other Presbyterians at the time, at least on equal terms.
Which is interesting since he wrote a book defending the Christian doctrine of slavery.
Yeah,
So
he's very much that kind of odd pro-slavery, yet sort of sees a place for the black church, and there's a real tension between Presbyterians who did and didn't in the era. John Jericho is the most famous one who did, but other people were more circumspect, especially in this area of Virginia. When he takes his pastorate in 1851, it's only been at that point just under 20 years since the largest slave rebellion in U.S. history happened 2 counties over in Southampton County. So Norfolk's about 55 miles from 55 miles from where Nat Turner's rebellion happened. So it was really in people's minds. It's one of the reasons why a lot of people defend slavery. They're out of fear. A great book, if anybody wants to read about this, is Carl Paulus's a book on fear, which motivated religious and non-religious people. Carl's not a Presbyterian, but it's a good book if anybody wants to understand fear.
So let's talk about this book that he wrote on the yellow fever epidemic. I was interested to see that he writes this book, and at first he didn't want to write it. He talks about how I think he might have been asked to write it, but he didn't want to because, as we'll talk a little bit later, he lost 4 of his own family members in this epidemic, and it was just too hard to write about. But then he realized that he needed to write about it, in part because he knew that it was going to spread northward, and he wanted to give a warning, relate the history, and he wrote it in a series of letters. I think to William Maxwell, was it? But that was interesting to me, sort of the context, the setting, why he wrote this book.
Yeah, so 2 interesting things that as a historian you kind of recognize is the book's written pretty quick. It's not a long labor of love. It's essentially a series of letters that are patched together. Pretty well done, though. They that's probably done by the publisher, and it's published in the North. It's published in New York City or Philadelphia. I can't remember, but it's a northern publisher, which is also unique. There weren't that many publishers in the South, but there are 2 in Richmond that he might have used. So the fact that he publishes it up north is telling. Another thing that's really interesting is the fact that it's published quickly. Not only is it written quickly, but it's published quickly. It's published by the winter of 1855, 1856. And you got to think about this, the 1850s, time doesn't move as fast then as it did for us. So he writes it quickly, it's published quickly. So somebody wants to get this book out, and there's a real question about who is that. It's probably not him. Most likely there's some feeling that it's Presbyterians in Richmond who are communicating with Presbyterians in Baltimore who want to get this thing out there. So a couple letters you can read, nothing real hard and fast, but all these guys are talking.
Yeah. So what are some of the things that stick out to you as you read this book, particularly in light of our own pandemic that we're going through now?
So he doesn't Jesus juke anything. That's probably the most interesting thing. He's not really concerned about soul winning with this particular volume. He's trying to write as much as he can like a journalist or even a scientist.
Yeah.
He's got a lot of things to say about how he's praying for people, about how he's thinking about them. He's worried about people's souls, but he's not really preaching in this book. It's very much the work of a man who is chronicling something he's trying to be pretty clinically precise about. That's the first thing you notice, is that this is a pastor who has very passionate beliefs about the gospel. If you read his other stuff, he's not shy about that, but this work has none of that. It's almost entirely absent. So he's really a guy who's trying to be a chronicler. And in many ways, that's pretty admirable, because by that time, he's relatively well known. He could have probably made a lot more money out of sensationalizing, but he doesn't sensationalize it. And yet it's still that sensational for us to read 160 some years later, because what's happening is just mind-boggling. even in a time of pandemic, you read it and you're like, oh my goodness, that's
Yeah.
kind of nuts. So the first thing you note is that he doesn't over spiritualize anything, no Jesus jukes. And then he actually doesn't use particularly sensational language in this book. It's fairly flat, what he uses, but it's still so compelling. I read the whole thing. I couldn't put it down. I just kind of, it's incredible what actually happened there in the Hampton Roads.
Well, the format of writing by letters is like that's part of the page turning nature of it, is that he's telling these letters and he'll tell you, here's what happened this week, and then the next letter is here's what's happened this week, or even I think at one point he said, I just wrote you yesterday, but so much has happened today, I've got to write you again.
Yeah, and the letters are not at sort of systemic intervals.
Right.
One will go 20 days, one will go 2 days. I think what's compelling about that is they're keeping track of things as much as they can in real time with their epidemic, much like we're trying to do with our own. And so some days are crazier than others, and so that kind of works out how he communicates.
And as you said, the scientist in him and the chemist, it's so interesting to hear him try to wrestle with, they didn't know where yellow fever came from. They had some different theories, but at the end he's talking about, is this contagious or not? He's trying to
But she concludes rightly that it wasn't contagious.
Right.
So he did that right without being a scientist officially, which is pretty impressive. So
right. But he's trying to give descriptions of symptoms, and like we were saying earlier, probably so that folks up north would know, here's what to look for. Here's some of the things that this particular strain of yellow fever is doing. So yeah, that was definitely part of the interesting facets of this book. You said he wasn't being sensational and wasn't over spiritualizing. One thing I did notice though was that he was being defensive, apologetic, trying to say, "Hey, we pastors didn't leave our post.
Right,
we were there." And in fact, he has this great quote on page 28 where he says, "The physician and the Christian pastor are, by their profession, called to minister to the sick, the dying, and the afflicted, and certainly a time of pestilence, when their services are most needed, is no time for them to flee. The question which they should ask is not, why should I stay, but why should I not stay? And no mere danger to themselves personally should enter into the decision of this question."
So one of the reasons he writes that is, and you probably couldn't get this by just reading his work, is that there had been a yellow fever epidemic in New Orleans in 1853. There had been systemic ones, but there's a big one in 1853. And a major complaint was that Protestant clergy had left the city while Roman Catholic priests had stayed in New Orleans. And so this sort of gets out. There's a book that's written on it. The Army does a report on it. And so he's probably, if he's interested in science, and we know he is, he's probably read that. And so he's making sure that no one's going to say the same thing about him. And what's funny is he's actually very careful to say, oh, and of course the Roman Catholic priests stayed too. Right. He notes that. He makes a list of all the clergy, and he pretty much is just trying to sort of very ironically say all the Christian ministers did their job. And so he's trying to be very careful. He doesn't want any sort of shame put upon him, like he's sort of, I think, convinced that the shame of the Protestants in New Orleans. So
yeah. What else stuck out to you as you read it and read his narrative?
He gets the scale of what's going on right. He's making guesses about how many people are dying a day, and not only is he right, but he is able to sort of relate that to us, the readers, in such a way that you're blown away by how massive this epidemic was. And he's just it's just him just trying to figure it out. You can almost get the feeling of he's working it out in his head as he's writing. And so it's massive. The combined population of Portsmouth and Norfolk in 1855 was probably somewhere between 24 and 25,000 people.
Okay.
The death count is between 3,500 and 4,000 people. And the vast majority of those are in Norfolk. And probably what's kind of fascinating is that that's probably undercounted a little bit. So a safe guess could be as many as 4,500 people. So you're talking about 1 out of 5, 1 out of 6 people dying in an epidemic. In a relatively concentrated area. The city of Norfolk was not geographically particularly spread out. And Portsmouth is right across the Elizabeth River. So it's a pretty tremendous death count, especially when you think about probably on the order of 45-ish% of each of those cities' populations were slaves.
Wow. Wow. And so he himself, as we mentioned earlier, lost 4 members of his family. His oldest daughter, who I believe at the time was 12, if I'm remembering correctly. He lost his wife's sister. He lost another daughter, and then he lost his wife.
Right.
And in a matter of days, I think weeks.
3, his wife, his sister-in-law, and his eldest daughter died in a span of 10 days.
10 days. Yeah.
And so there's kind of this sense of you think about that, that's a week and a half, and boom, boom, boom. And what's interesting is that they're asking the question of, are people going to die because they had essentially false recoveries too. And so it was emotionally a gut-wrenching thing for him. He's still going out of the house as this is going on too. So he's still doing his job as creatively as he can, as safely as he can, while he's not sure if his family is going to be alive when he gets back or not. So,
well, and as a pastor living right now during COVID-19, really, I will thank the Lord I haven't had anyone in my church get sick, have to be in a hospital. But I don't know that I could go and visit them. Right, family members are not allowed to go and see people who are sick in the hospital, and so, as I read this narrative, and then other narratives, guys like Benjamin Morgan Palmer down in New Orleans in the later 1850s, doing ministry to the sick, to the dying, that is both such an encouragement to me as a pastor. It's also, given the contagious nature of our current pandemic, I'm not able to do that, and so that's, I miss that, being able to be there with folks. The other tragic part about his family dying is that he tells how they were ready to leave like the next day to go see their 12-year-old daughter who had gotten sick, and then they came down with it like that night. And so just it's just jarring and tragic in its import.
And he did one thing that's really interesting is what you just mentioned. There's a lot of false hope that they encounter. They moved their family to Hampton for a little bit. Hampton's across the James River Delta from Norfolk, and people think we're going to be safe. Well, the infection, they're not sure, is it following us here? Are we getting it here? You think you're going to be safe one place and you're not, and then they get sort of this terrible death of a 12-year-old girl dropped on him. And so it's probably the most compelling thing about this book is how much he lives with death. Death is constant. Every page, every other page, someone has died, and not just someone he knows.
Right, in his church or
yeah. And so, at the end of all this, there were 63 orphans in First Pres Norfolk, which is a staggering number. Can you imagine? And it was a sizable church. It was probably 400 or 500 people at the time regularly attending. 63 orphans is a huge number for a mega church nowadays. Imagine it on what we would think of as just a large church.
Yeah.
So,
well, and that's something that in reading 18th and 19th century American Presbyterians or any work from that period, they lived with death. Like you said, they knew and understood death all the time, whether it was in childbirth, whether it was, infants dying, in a way that we in the 21st century just cannot fathom. thankfully, right? I mean, because of medical technology, and yet because they understood death in such personal ways, it seemed like there was a deeper grasp of the scriptures, of the Christian life. Reflect on that for me.
So I think you're absolutely right. They know death. They don't ever get used to it, though. I think this is one of the things we almost think they got used to it. They never get used to it. One of the things at the beginning of this book, and Caleb, you've read it, so you'll recall this. They kind of panic. There's a panic when everyone figures out we have a yellow fever epidemic here. So I think rightfully so, we're quick, rightfully, to criticize our own society for sort of flippantly taking the health and the medical advances we have maybe for granted, but they're still pretty similar to us. They freak out when people die, just like we do. They never get used to it. They ask questions like, how did this happen?
Right.
Just like we do. So what's interesting is, as much of a difference as there is, they're also really similar to us. When the yellow fever breaks out, what's the first thing everybody does? They look for who to blame. People are shocked at this happen. Is it the ship's captain? Is it the Norfolk police? Did somebody not quarantine? Right. That was really, really interesting. Right. They asked that question.
Yeah.
And so they react so differently and yet so similarly in the way we do, that you find yourself not comforted, but surprisingly feeling a little bit of solidarity for them as they walk through this thing, because they are surprised by it.
Yeah. Well, and we can close with this, but the other question they asked is not just how did this happen, but why did this happen? And this comes out even more in a sermon that Armstrong preaches 4 months after the sort of the quarantine began, 4 months after everyone scattered who could and who wanted to. But it's the first time that they're able to gather as a church together. And he mentions the large number of orphans in the sermon. Unfortunately, this sermon is not on our Law College Press website, because we only put documents on our website that we can find actual old PDFs, like from the time period, from the 18th and 19th century. And this sermon, you can find it online. It's on the First Presbyterian Norfolk website. It's a sermon entitled "The Lesson of the Pestilence," and it's a sermon on Hebrews 12:10. And he has a paragraph that I wanted to read. Let me pull it up here. He says, Hebrews 12:10, talking about that trials come, afflictions, God disciplines, so that we might that God might enable us to partake of his holiness, that we might share his holiness. And he says this, let me read. He says, "Christian, here, have not your own heart's utterances, as you have smarted under the rod, accorded with his voice from heaven," in Hebrews 12. "Seem there not something then to whisper in our ear? Fool that thou hast been, to live so much for this present world, so forgetful of the great end and aim of life. And was there not the purpose formed, if God spares me, I will by his grace become more fully a partaker of his holiness. I will henceforth be more decidedly on the Lord's side, more earnest in prayer, more constant in effort, more habitually faithful and humble, sitting at Jesus' feet, that I may learn of him." And he goes on just to reflect, not necessarily in the book, like as you were mentioning, that's not the place where he wanted to have this, but certainly to his people in the from the pulpit in the church, he wanted to remind them that God has purposes, and one of those purposes is our holiness, our growth in grace. And I imagine, have you seen that in other, particularly pandemic, epidemic sources?
Yeah, the probably the best known yellow fever epidemic that historians encounter, whether you're in grad school or in or as a historian, is in 1793 there's a yellow fever epidemic that goes through Philadelphia. Country's brand new. George Washington's president. Philadelphia is still the capital of the United States at this point. So that's been written on a good bit. And one of the interesting things is we assume that pastors are going to use every opportunity to say something, to find some reason. I think what's been really compelling is that there's typically a waiting period. They do wait. They're pretty judicious about not trying to assign any specific sort of divine meaning to what happens in the moment. Um, some of these guys, in one particular situation, a guy waited until 1795 to preach a sermon about something that had happened a year and a half earlier. So I think you get the sense of there's a real reticence to sort of in the moment say, this is why this is happening. And 4 months is a pretty long time for 1855. You have the telegraph, you have a lot more modern things than you did in 1795. So I think it's telling that they wait. I also think that as far as 19th century pastors go, Armstrong's still a little. He would be a warm fuzzy for his era. He's not denouncing things. There's a guy, George McDuff, who's also on the Log College website, who anytime anything happened bad, he was writing mainly between 1810 and 1820. He's finding a particular societal failure. Armstrong doesn't do that. He says, look, this is really at this point something that we just as God's people need to worry about. We're not looking around and assigning blame to any other group. We've experienced affliction. God has brought this on us for a reason. So I think that that's telling. He's really bringing it back to his people. He's being a pastor in that sermon in a really precise way. He's not being a cultural commentator. He's not being a scientist. He's not engaging in political speculation, which is funny because he did kind of do that in the Summer of Pestilence. He takes a pretty big swipe at secessionists in the book, which is one of the interesting things about it. So Armstrong, he's a fascinating guy, and anybody who visits the book and reads all the way through it will sort of be surprised at that. Here's this Virginia pastor taking a pretty big and open swipe at the idea of disunion. But in his sermon, he doesn't really talk about politics.
No, and I appreciate what you said, that he's being a pastor to his people. He is wanting to minister to them the word of God, the comfort of God. I wish that we could find this sermon and have it on the website as well, but at least it's available on the internet. But I think that's what I appreciate about our website, is that you're able to see these men and their writings in such a variety of different formats and venues, whether it's history of this pandemic, but then also the sermons, the pastoral labors of these men. And so we have so much to learn from them.
And just as a plug, one of the nice things about the website is not just that they're there, but they're so varied. There's so many different types of things you can find. Even, this isn't the only work on a pastor and during an epidemic on the website. And so there's quite a bit there. It's a great website. I know you know that, but just for people listening, I hope they'll also visit as well.
Thanks, Miles.
Super interesting.
Appreciate it. Well, man, thank you so much for doing this with me.
Yeah, thank you.
So if this goes well, we may try to do it again.
Absolutely.
And so, all right, man. Well, have a great night, and we'll talk to you later.
All right. Take care, Caleb.
Bye-bye.